now we're going to run through some repeated measures ANOVA examples. Okay, so this is one from a textbook. Are some types of bullying perceived as more harmful than others? Okay, so I'm going to open this file, bullying.save in SPSS. It's right here. Okay, so we had 10 participants in this study, and we asked them to rate different levels of bullying. Okay. The harmfulness of the bullying, of high school physical, verbal, and covert bullying. Okay, so they rated these on the scale of 1 to 10, with higher numbers indicating a greater potential for harm. Okay. So now that we have this in our table, notice each level has a column. Okay, so now we need to run it. So we go to Analyze, General Linear Model. We're doing a repeated measures. Okay. We could leave this as factor 1, but that's a little vague. So let's change that to what our IB was, which was bullying. Okay. It had 3 different levels. So we're going to create a factor named bullying, and we're telling it that it had 3 different levels. So we add that. Now we have to define what those 3 levels are. Again, it doesn't matter which order you put these in, but you need to remember it so you can interpret your post hocs. So we're going to put in physical, covert, and verbal. So we're telling it that our factor of bullying had 3 levels, and these columns represent the 3 levels. Now we could just run it, but we wouldn't have all of our information. The only thing over here you need to worry about is the options. Okay, remember we want our descriptives, we want our estimates. Now we'll go ahead and ask for our post hocs, even though we don't know if we need them yet or not, because it's better to have them than to not. So we say we want to look at them for bullying, we want to compare main effects. And see, there's only 3 options here, just we'll stick with LSD. Okay. Continue, and OK. Now don't get freaked out here. SPSS gives us a lot of tables, and most of them you don't even have to look at. So for your lab and lab report data, I deleted the tables that you don't even care about to keep you from being confused. But the first table here, it just tells you what your levels were and how you assign them. So right here, it tells you your numbers. Then it gives you the means and standard deviations of your 3 levels. So we can see here that covert bullying was rated as higher than the other 2, and the other 2 were about the same. So let's see if any of those were statistically significant. This multivariate text box, don't worry about it. We're going to delete that. The next table is the test of sphericity. That tells you if we meet our assumptions or not. In this case we do, but again, you don't need to worry about that. So we're not even going to look at that table. So here's our ANOVA table right here. We're going to look at the sphericity assumed. So we see our degrees of freedom are 2, and down here our error degrees of freedom for sphericity assumed are 18. So our degrees of freedom in this case are 2 and 18. Do not worry about any of the other rows. I don't want to see those numbers ever reported. Okay, don't worry about the mean squares or the sums of squareds column. All we care about are degrees of freedom. Here's our F. See, you'll notice F is the exact same in all of these, so it doesn't really matter. 6.04. Here's our P. For the sphericity assumed row, our P is 0.01. And our partial eta squared is 0.40. So we are significant. That means there is a difference in the types of bullying. The next one is tests of within squares contrasts. It has this linear and quadratic. Don't worry about that. That table goes away. Okay. This test of between subjects effects, again, it's nothing for you to worry about. SPSS gives you a lot more information than you actually need for this class. Next part is the estimated marginal means. That's our post hocs. Okay. Again, it tells you the means and standard deviations of your 3 groups. But notice the labels aren't here. So you have to refer back up here to remember which groups were which number. It gives you your means, your standard errors, and your confidence intervals. If you did want to report confidence intervals, you would find them here, but I don't require you to report them, so don't worry too much about those. So now let's look down at our post hocs. So first we're going to compare 1 and 2. So group 1 was physical, group 2 was covert. So we're comparing physical bullying to covert bullying. So these were significant. P equals 0.008. So we could say that physical bullying and covert bullying were rated differently on the amount of harm. If you want to know which one's higher, you could look at the sign, or you could just look up here at the means. Covert bullying had a higher mean. So we would say here that covert bullying was rated as more harmful than physical bullying. and you would report this P of 0.008. Now let's compare groups 1 and 3, which were physical and verbal. We could see here the means were very close. So if we look here and we want to compare groups 1 and groups 3, we go over here to significance, 0.823. That is not significant. That's telling us that there is no difference between physical and verbal. So in your results, you would say physical and verbal bullying were rated as equally harmful. Now we still have one more pair to compare. We've compared physical to covert, and we've converted physical to verbal. So now we have to compare covert to verbal. So we need to compare groups 2 and 3. So we go down here, we look at 2, here's 3, we go over 0.3 or 0.038. So that is significant, it's less than 0.05. So there is a difference between groups 2 and 3. So in our results, we would say that covert bullying was rated as more harmful than verbal bullying. Okay? That's how you read the post-hocs. Then it gives you this multivariate test. Again, don't worry about that. So even though SPSS gives you a lot of outputs, for the sake of your labs and lab report, I've only given you these here. I've deleted all the others. If we wanted to see a graph for these results, which I would want to do, we would go here to graphs. We would say legacy dialogues. I would want to see an error bar graph. And for repeated measures, we have to say summaries of separate variables because we had to put each level as its own variable in SPSS. And then to define it, we say which things we want it to graph. So we move our 3 levels of bullying over here. You could play with options and titles if you want, or you could just hit OK. And this would give us an error bar graph right here. So you can kind of see from this graph that the covert bullying was rated as more harmful than physical and verbal. But with these confidence intervals overlapping so much, I wouldn't be too sure about the results. So even though they were significant, these confidence intervals kind of tell another story. And that might be something you want to put in your discussion. And the main reason for this, and notice how wide these confidence intervals are, the main reason for that is because our N was only 10 people. If we had more people, then theoretically these things would shrink and we would see a bigger difference. Okay. So now to go back to this. Okay. So this is how we might report our results in this case. Different types of bullying were perceived as significantly more harmful than others with a large effect size. This is where we give our F with the 2 degrees of freedom. F equals 6.04. P equals 0.01, and we have to put this word partial. Partial eta squared equals 0.4. Okay, so this is just our overall ANOVA results. You always want to start reporting the overall ANOVA results. If these are significant, then you want to go into reporting the post-hocs. Okay. So we might do something like this. Covert bullying was seen as more harmful, and give its mean and standard deviation, than both physical bullying, we give its mean and standard deviation, and then this P is what compared covert to physical, and verbal bullying. We give the mean and standard deviation of verbal bullying, and then this P represents the difference between covert and verbal. So in one sentence, we're saying that covert was seen as more harmful than the other two. So we've compared 2 of our relationships in one sentence. In the third sentence, or in the next sentence, we want to compare the third relationship. The difference between physical and verbal bullying was not significant, and we give its P. So all it took was 2 sentences to sum up all of our post-hocs, and then 1 sentence for the overall, which was up here. Okay. So in 3 sentences total, we have done our results. Okay. But what might we talk about in a discussion? I don't really have that here, but we might talk about different levels of bullying and why it makes sense that covert bullying was more harmful. We might want to talk about how we only had 10 people and our scale is only on a 1 to 10, so there wasn't a lot of range, there wasn't a lot of room for variance. So we might want to consider a different scale, maybe different questions that assess bullying. We might want to talk about greater sample size, okay, things like that. Same thing you would talk about in any discussion. Okay. And then I've already talked through how you would get a bar graph. Here's another version of that same bar graph. That shows you covert, verbal, and physical. Now, if you were to put this in a lab report and you had the time and the access to SPSS, I would tell you to adjust the titles to be more intuitive than what I've given you. But again, don't worry about that. Okay? We just want to have some graphical representation of what our results look like. Okay? So now you have everything you need to do Lab 11, but I wanted to go ahead and go through another example with you, just so you see another way. Okay. So we have this, let me see where it was. So this is our data. It said individuals will recall less if they take a test together than if they recalled individually or individually and then compared answers, which is called collaborative. So they want to see that if a group of people took a test all together, then they're not going to remember the content as much than if they took the test by themselves or if they took it by themselves and then compared answers. Okay. And it tells you here the scores on the exam are from 1 to 100 or 0 to 100. And the null hypothesis is that exam scores will not be different. Okay. So I put all these numbers into SPSS. And we're going to see if there's really a difference between those groups. So again, we go to Analyze, General Linear Model, Repeated Measures. Okay. We have a factor. You could name it whatever you want. For now, I'm just going to leave it as factor. But it does have 3 levels, so we add that. Got to define it. So we put in our 3 columns that represent the 3 levels of our variable. We go to Options. We ask for descriptives and effect size. And then over here is how we ask for our post hocs. So I say continue. We run our results. We go back to our output screen. Okay. So now here again it tells us our different groups and what numbers we gave them. It gives us our descriptive statistics. You can just see looking at the means, the collaborative seemed to be higher than the individual and both were higher than the group. Okay. Get rid of that table, we don't need it. I don't want you to worry about that table. So if we just look at sphericity assumed, degrees of freedom 2, the degree of freedom is 98. F is 38.295, so we would round that to 38.30. P is less than 0.001. Partial eta squared is 0.44. Okay. Don't worry about that one. Don't worry about that one. Okay. So it was significant. There was a difference between our groups somewhere. Now that we know there was a difference, we have to go to our post hocs to figure it out. So our post hocs, remember 1, 2, and 3 represent collaborative, individual, and group. So first we're going to compare 1 and 2, which was collaborative and individual. Those 2 groups were significantly different. So you would say collaborative scored higher than individual, and you would give P is less than 0.001. Then groups 1 and 3, 1 is collaborative, 3 is group. So we would say that collaborative also scored higher than the group. P is less than 0.001. Now for our last pair, we have to compare 2 and 3. So we would go down here and look at 2 and 3. So for 2 and 3, remember up here we're looking at individual and group. So we would say that individual and group were also significant. So individual scored higher than group. P equals 0.013. Don't worry about that test. So our hypothesis was supported. People who worked in a group did worse on the exam than those who worked individually or collaboratively. All 3 groups were significantly different. Now if we wanted to look at a graph for that, again, legacy dialogues, you could do a bar, but I like the error bar. Okay. Again, we want simple summaries of separate variables. We put in our 3 things here, say OK, and here's our pretty picture. And this just shows you that people who did the collaborative scored much higher on the test than those who did individual and those who did on the group. So even though we were able to say groups were significantly different, this bar graph is just a really nice way to show it, and it shows it much better than the numbers would. So on your lab report, I would really like for you to include the bar graphs that I have given you in the output. So that is now all I have for repeated measures ANOVA. If you have any questions, please post them in the discussion forum on Blackboard, comments on YouTube, or send me an email. I have also created a discussion forum with contact information for a few classmates who have been willing to be peer tutors, and for Wendy. You could email any of us and ask questions about this. So please let me know. I know repeated measures ANOVA is a little harder to understand, so please let me know right away if you have any questions.